Welcome to Sleepy Lore.
Tonight, we tell the story of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the ancient world, and a man who had to choose between a long life and a glorious one.
A myth of grief and rage and friendship, of what it means to be mortal when you are almost not, and of the strange peace that sometimes comes after the hardest losses. Allow yourself to settle in, breathe slowly, and let the story carry you. Before the war, there was a wedding. On the slopes of Mount Pelion, the gods had gathered to celebrate the marriage of a mortal king named Peleus to a sea nymph named Thetis. It was a rare thing, a god choosing a mortal, or a mortal worthy of a god, and so the celebration was grand, and nearly every immortal came, nearly everyone. One goddess had not been invited. Her name was Eris, the goddess of discord. And when she arrived anyway, uninvited and unwelcome, she set a golden apple on the table. It was inscribed with 3 words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses reached for it at the same moment: Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. The quarrel that followed that apple, the choosing of Paris, the promise of the most beautiful woman in the world, the taking of Helen from her husband's house in Sparta. All of that is another story for another night. What matters tonight is what came from that wedding, from that union of Peleus and Thetis. What came from it was Achilles. Thetis knew from the moment her son was born what his fate would be. She was a goddess of the sea, which meant she was old enough to understand fate clearly, to see it not as something that might be avoided, but as a current you are already inside. She held her infant son, and she knew 2 things at once: that he would be the greatest warrior the world had ever seen, and that he would die young. She could not change the second truth, but she could try to change the first. She carried him to the river Styx, the river that forms the boundary between the living world and the dead, and she dipped him into the black water. The Styx was not merely a river, it was the most binding force in existence. Gods swore their most serious oaths by it, and to be touched by it was to take on something of its nature, something permanent, something that could not be undone. She held him by the heel and she dipped him. Everywhere the water touched him, he became invulnerable. No blade could pierce that skin, no spear could find purchase, no arrow could do more than glance off, except for one small place, the heel she held. The single point where her hand had kept the water away. She brought him home, and for a while she tried to keep him from the war that she could see coming. Achilles grew up on Mount Pelion, raised by the wise centaur Chiron, half horse, half man, who taught him medicine and music and hunting and the arts of war. Chiron was the great teacher of heroes, patient and gentle in a way that most creatures capable of violence are not gentle. He taught Achilles to play the lyre. He taught him to run faster than any man alive. He taught him everything he needed to be what he was going to become. But Thetis was still afraid. When the call came for Greek warriors to join the expedition to Troy, she hid her son on the island of Skyros, disguised among the daughters of the king, wearing women's clothing and answering to a woman's name. She believed that if she could keep him from the war, she could keep him from his fate. It was Odysseus who found him, Odysseus, who was clever in the way that the sea is clever, always moving, always finding the path of least resistance, always arriving where it intended to arrive. He came to Skyros with gifts, jewelry and fine cloth, and placed among them, almost as an afterthought, a beautiful sword and shield. When a trumpet sounded, a trick, a false alarm of attack, only one of the girls reached for the weapon. And so Achilles went to Troy. The war lasted 10 years. 10 years of a Greek army camped on the shores of a foreign land, fighting a city whose walls would not fall. The Trojans were brave and skilled, and their city was strong. The Greeks were powerful but impatient, and as the years wore on, the impatience grew. Through all of it, Achilles was the center. He was not the commander. That was Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, proud and difficult and carrying the authority of the expedition in his name, if not always in his character. Achilles was something else. He was the best of them, and everyone knew it, and everyone arranged themselves around that fact the way you arrange furniture around the source of light in a room. He fought with a ferocity that was almost frightening to watch. Not the wild, uncontrolled ferocity of someone who doesn't care if they live, but the precise, devastating ferocity of someone who is fully alive, who is doing exactly the thing they were made for, and who cannot be stopped. And beside him, always, was Patroclus. Patroclus was not the greatest warrior. He was not the fastest or the strongest, or the one the poets would sing about first. He was quieter than Achilles, gentler, more patient with the other men, the kind of person who remembered names, who noticed when someone was struggling, who would sit with the sick and the frightened when no one else would. They had known each other since boyhood. Patroclus had come to live in Achilles' father's house as a child, after an accident that required him to leave his own home, and the two had grown up side by side. By the time they reached Troy, whatever separated them, their different natures, their different gifts, had been worn smooth by years of proximity until what was left was something simple and deep and difficult to name. They were everything to each other. In the 10th year of the war, something broke. Agamemnon and Achilles quarreled, a quarrel over honor and prize and the 1,000 small indignities that accumulate when strong men live too close together for too long. The details matter less than the result. Achilles withdrew from the fighting. He took his soldiers, the Myrmidons, and he sat by his ships at the edge of the sea, and he refused to fight. The Greeks struggled without him. They had grown too accustomed to his presence, too reliant on the way battles reorganized themselves around him. Without Achilles, the Trojans pushed them back toward the sea, toward the ships, toward a disaster that began to look inevitable. Patroclus watched this happen. He watched the men he knew dying on the plain, and he felt it the way you feel the suffering of people you love. Not with distance, not as information, but in the body, as a weight that becomes harder to carry each day. He went to Achilles, and he asked to wear Achilles' armor, the divine armor made by the god Hephaestus, gleaming and unmistakable, the armor that every Trojan on the field knew by sight. He asked to lead the Myrmidons into battle, wearing that armor so that the Trojans would think Achilles had returned and would retreat. Achilles said yes. Perhaps he thought it would work, that Patroclus would drive the Trojans back and come home safely. Perhaps he was too full of his own anger to think clearly about what he was agreeing to. Perhaps there are some decisions you make when you don't know you are making them, when you say yes without understanding what the yes contains. Patroclus went into battle wearing the armor of a god. He fought well. He drove the Trojans back from the ships just as he had promised he would. For a time, it worked. Then he met Hector. Hector was the greatest of the Trojans, the best of their warriors, and also the best of them in every other way. Brave and loving and burdened with the knowledge that his city was going to fall, that he was fighting a war whose end he could already see coming. He fought anyway because his people were inside those walls, and his wife and his young son who did not yet understand what war was. Hector killed Patroclus. He stood over the body, and he did not know at first what he had done. That the man in the divine armor was not Achilles, that the war had just changed again in a way no one had intended. When the news reached Achilles, he made a sound that the poets described as something between a cry and silence, something that had no name because it had rarely been heard before. He went to the shore and he sat in the sand, and his mother came to him rising from the sea. She sat beside him in the way that only a god can sit beside a mortal. Fully present and also slightly apart, the way a very old and very loving presence sometimes is. He told her what had happened. He told her what he was going to do. She already knew. She had always known. She told him that if he returned to the fighting, if he killed Hector in revenge for Patroclus, he would die soon after. His own fate was tied to Hector's. This was the shape of things, the current he was inside. Achilles listened, and then he said, "It does not matter." He had spent 10 years being the greatest warrior alive. He had fought for honor and for glory and for the stubborn refusal to let anyone take from him what was his. He had sat out of the war for weeks to prove a point. All of it had made sense, had seemed important while Patroclus was alive. Now Patroclus was dead, and the only thing that made sense was what came next. He returned to the fighting. He tore through the Trojan ranks with a grief that had become something else, not the clean anger of his earlier battles, but something rawer and colder and more absolute. He found Hector. Their battle was the one the poets returned to most often, not because it was long, but because both men understood what it meant. Hector knew he was going to lose. He had known it before the battle began. He stood his ground anyway because he could not do otherwise, because he was the kind of man who stands his ground. Achilles killed him, and then in the days that followed, in a part of the story that is quieter than the battle, and in some ways more important, something happened that surprised even those who had watched Achilles closely for 10 years. The old Trojan king, Priam, Hector's father, came alone across the dark plain to the Greek camp, past all the sentinels and the dangers, to ask for his son's body. He came to Achilles' tent. He found the greatest Greek warrior sitting in his grief, and he knelt before him and he touched Achilles' hands, the hands that had killed his son, and he asked. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He simply said, "I have done what no man before me has ever done. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." Achilles looked at this old man kneeling before him, and something in him that had been clenched very tight for a very long time finally let go. He wept. Priam wept. They wept together in the tent in the dark for everything that had been lost, which was enormous, which was more than either of them could hold alone. Achilles returned the body. He gave the Trojans 12 days to mourn. Not because the war was over, it wasn't. Not because his grief was finished, it wasn't either. But because in that tent, in that strange meeting between enemies, something had been understood that the battlefield could not teach, that grief is the same on both sides, that the fathers and the sons and the ones who love them are the same on both sides. He had been the greatest warrior alive. He had chosen the short life over the long one, the glorious path over the safe one. He had lost the person who mattered most to him, and then he had done what grief required, and then quietly, almost gently, he had chosen a moment of mercy in the middle of a war. He did not live long after. The arrow found him, as the oracle had always said it would, finding the single unguarded place. But in the tent with Priam, in that brief and unexpected stillness, he had been something more than a warrior. He had been, for a moment, simply human, feeling what humans feel, extending what humans can extend to each other across even the widest distances. That moment, too, is part of the story. Rest now. Let the tent be quiet. Let the war be far away. Let whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever grief or anger or long-held tension, let it be here with you, without needing to be resolved. You are still? The night is long, sleep is close. Good night.